We check our phones, we glance at our wrists. Look, we live by the second, right? We built clocks to master time, to slice it into these neat, digestible, orderly little units. But there is one clock that completely spits in the face of that orderly ambition, the Doomsday Clock. It doesn't measure the rotation of the Earth or the vibration of a cesium atom. Honestly, it isn't even a working clock. You can't wind it. It was designed for the exact opposite purpose, to count down to the end of time itself. It is a paradox, isn't it? We use the same tools of order to measure our inevitable disorder. Does this clock actually predict our future, or is it just amplifying our own dread? Today, we are going to tear down that digital interface and figure out why we turned a tool of measurement into a tool of absolute crushing anxiety. The rhythmic, hypnotic ticking of an 18th century clock tower fills the space. Imagine you step inside, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sound, it's the smell. A heavy, intoxicating mix of machine oil, cold iron, and dust-covered oak. Sunlight filters through a high, narrow window, illuminating millions of tiny particles dancing in the air, suspended in shafts of light that cut through the gloom. Before you, the massive mechanism looms. It's a tangle of brass gears, some as large as a carriage wheel, all interlocking with a precision that feels almost aggressive. Each tooth on the main gear is worn smooth from centuries of service. When it moves, it's not just a click, it's a heavy, reverberating thud that you feel in your chest. In this space, time is physical, heavy, and relentlessly demanding. You are observing a masterpiece of Newtonian order. But this mechanical precision is a mask. We have spent centuries perfecting clocks that reflect the universe's reliability, only to create a counter-narrative. In 1947, the Doomsday Clock entered our collective consciousness. Now, here is the detail that gets lost. It wasn't a mechanism, it was an image, just ink on paper. It graced the cover of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a publication founded by Manhattan Project researchers who were suddenly struck by a realization. They had built a weapon that could erase the concept of tomorrow, and they felt an unbearable, desperate need to warn the public. The artist, Marta Langsdorff, was married to one of the project's lead physicists. When editors asked her for a graphic, she simply sketched a clock with the hands at 7 minutes to midnight. She later said, with the casual detachment of an artist, it seemed the right time. And that was it. A designer's intuition became the universal barometer for human survival. You'd think a clock, something built for the predictable linear tick of seconds, would stick to time. But look at what the Doomsday Clock actually measures. It doesn't track celestial bodies. It tracks political volatility, nuclear proliferation, and the shifting temperature of our planet. Consider the disconnect here. We have taken a precision instrument designed to impose order on chaos, and we have repurposed it to quantify the shapeless, shifting mass of global dread. We aren't measuring time anymore. We are measuring the distance between ourselves and the abyss. I admit, when I first looked into this, I found the whole thing almost cynical. A clock that tells you how long we have until the end? It sounds like pulp sci-fi. But think about the gas gauge in your car. It tells you exactly how much fuel you have left before you are stranded. The Doomsday Clock is just a fuel gauge for civilization. We are obsessed with precision, yet we are terrified of the only outcome we cannot control, our own extinction. Maybe the clock isn't about the apocalypse at all. It is the only way we know how to face the fear of the unknown. That brings us to the history of these hand movements, a record of human panic. In 1949, when the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb, the clock jumped to 3 minutes to midnight. And then, in 1953, the US tested the first hydrogen bomb. That was a terrifying leap. We weren't just talking about splitting atoms anymore. We were talking about fusion, about a weapon that could wipe a city off the map in a blink. That event condensed our entire safety margin into a tiny window of minutes. We were closer than we had ever been. But look at the swing. Fast forward to 1991. The Cold War dissolves, the Soviet Union collapses, the Berlin Wall is just rubble, and the clock ticks back to 17 minutes to midnight. 17! That is the furthest we have ever been from the end. It was this moment of collective exhaling, like the mechanism had finally been fixed and the pendulum was swinging freely again. You had this feeling that the gear was finally greased. Then we hit 2017. The clock moves to 2.5 minutes to midnight. They used a 30-second increment for the first time in history. The reasoning felt alien. They cited climate change, cyber warfare, and political rhetoric. Try to square that. Science usually operates on absolute, observable facts. You measure the decay of a particle. You measure the radiation of an isotope. But this clock, it's measuring the weight of an editorial opinion on international stability. It is not a scientific instrument. It is a mirror. We stare into it, waiting for an objective answer, but we are only seeing the reflection of our own anxiety. The hands do not move because time demands it. They move because we are holding the dial. That is the true weight of this paradox. We are the architects of the countdown. If we are the ones who define the minutes, we are the ones who decide when the ticking stops. Is it a prediction of the future, or are we simply calibrating our own self-fulfilling prophecy? If we are the clockmakers, why have we chosen to craft a device that only knows how to tick toward midnight? Perhaps the question isn't whether the clock can predict the end, but whether we have the courage to stop turning the dial. We are left with this stark realization. The clock doesn't tell time. It tells us who we are, right now, in the face of our own mortality. The hands are set not by the physics of the universe, but by the weight of our current fear. When we look at that dial, are we watching a countdown, or are we simply staring at the deadline we have set for ourselves? Think about the last time you felt a genuine cold knot of fear. You know that feeling, the kind that makes the hairs on your arm stand up instantly. It is a primal reaction, a biological warning system. But the real question is, how do you quantify that? How do you put a number on the end of the world? Most scientific institutions rely on hard, rigid data, radiation counts, seismic shifts, chemical half-lives. But the most prestigious group of scientists on the planet chose a different path. They rely on an analog clock, 12 numbers, 2 hands, a sweeping second hand. It is an absurdly simple, outdated tool to measure the most complex, terrifying existential threat humanity has ever engineered. It shouldn't work. We treat it like the ultimate authority on our survival. But here is the thing. Why would the masters of the scientific method, people who cracked the atom, turn to a symbol that does not actually tell time? We are going to step inside that room and see why the most terrifying countdown in history is, quite frankly, just a piece of paper. The office where it started was not a high-tech bunker. It was the 1947 headquarters of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in Chicago. The space was claustrophobic, saturated with the smell of stale coffee, mimeograph ink, and cigarette smoke. It was a hub of manic intellectual anxiety. If you were there, you would hear the relentless staccato clacking of manual typewriters, a frantic rhythm meant to inform the public before it was too late. Martel Langsdorff, the artist who sketched the original clock, wasn't an engineer calculating yield rates. She was an observer, tasked with making the abstract horror of the nuclear age readable. She wasn't building a scientific instrument. She was designing a warning sign. Consider what a clock represents. Order. Gears, springs, the steady, predictable pulse of a heartbeat. We trust it because we believe the universe is, deep down, a rational machine. But the Doomsday Clock is fundamentally dishonest. It does not track the rotation of the Earth or the vibration of an atom. It tracks the chaotic, volatile surge of human political aggression. We are using a tool defined by perfect, unyielding order to quantify the most disordered, terrifying possibility we have ever invented, our own sudden, engineered end. It is like trying to measure the force of a hurricane with a ruler. The mismatch is the point. The scientists involved, Oppenheimer, Einstein, the architects of the Manhattan Project, were not checking equations when they set the time. They were reacting to a reality they knew better than anyone. They had seen the flash. They knew that physics is abstract. Mathematical models do not make a general public panic. A clock, however, is universal. They needed a way to transmit their own fear into a language everyone could read. This is the detail that changed my perspective. The Doomsday Clock wasn't a calculation, it was a scream. A visual attempt to get us to notice how dangerous the silence had become. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb, and the clock jumped to 3 minutes to midnight. But the real shift happened in 1953. The United States tested the first hydrogen bomb, Ivy Mike. We aren't talking about splitting an atom anymore. We are talking about fusion, the power that fuels the sun. When that device detonated, it didn't just explode. It effectively erased the island of Elijulabad from the map, leaving a crater a mile wide in the seafloor. The scale of destruction shifted. If you were standing at the epicenter, there would be no warning, no pain, just instant vaporization. The scientists understood this jump in magnitude, and they condensed our safety margin to just 2 minutes. We were effectively sitting on a powder keg with a lit fuse. But here is the strange, jarring paradox. Think about 1991. The Berlin Wall had crumbled, the Soviet Union was dissolving, and it felt like the Cold War, that global, existential chokehold we'd lived under for decades, was finally snapping. The bulletin set the clock to 17 minutes to midnight. 17. That is the furthest we have ever been from the end. It felt like the gears of history had finally been greased. But look at that date, 1991. Now compare that to today. It feels like a different universe, doesn't it? That buffer, which back then felt like a permanent, hard-won victory for humanity, now looks like a brief, accidental pause in a much longer, darker timeline. It wasn't the end of history, it was just a deep breath before the plunge. And honestly, that makes the current moment feel even more precarious. Recently, however, the clock has come under intense fire from the scientific community itself. Critics argue that by trying to quantify global risk, the bulletin is moving outside its lane. A physicist, they argue, is trained to measure light, heat, and velocity, not geopolitical instability, diplomatic friction, or the efficacy of climate policy. These critics contend that the clock is no longer a scientific tool, but a piece of political theater. They say that by mixing nuclear threats with cyber warfare and climate change, the bulletin is muddying the data. They argue it makes the clock less a precise instrument and more a subjective, biased barometer of whatever board members happen to be worried about that year. And it is a valid critique. Science requires empirical observation. You measure the weight of an atom, not the weight of a policy. Yet, I wonder if the critics are missing the forest for the trees. Perhaps the apocalypse is not a single event, like a bomb drop, anymore. It is a cascading systems failure. By expanding the criteria, the clock stopped measuring one weapon and started measuring the fragile architecture of our entire modern existence. The move to 30-second increments feels clinical, hyper-precise. But does adding more precision actually make the prediction better, or just more anxious? We have traced this clock from the early, terrifying shadow of the bomb to the complex, modern dread of our current age. It brings us back to the fundamental friction. This clock is a tool we built. It is a measurement we calibrated. Yet we treat the hands as if they are moved by some external, unstoppable force. If we are the ones holding the dial, and we are the ones defining the risks, why do we stare at this clock with such paralyzing dread? The real mystery isn't whether the clock is accurate. It is why we, the architects of our own survival, keep turning the hands toward midnight while doing so little to move them back. Now, think about your watch for a second. It ticks. A hairspring unwinding, a gear clicking forward 60 times a minute. It is a steady physical movement. It tells you time is a reliable, infinite line, a continuous loop of seconds that you can measure, track, and ultimately trust. But then, look at the Doomsday Clock. It does not measure seconds. It tracks the distance between us and a catastrophic blast. We built a machine that does not measure time. It measures the probability of our own extinction. So why do we build countdowns? And why, when the world feels like it is fracturing, do we find comfort in a clock that warns us we are out of time? We are not measuring the end. We are shouting into the void to see if it screams back. Let's step back into a workspace in the late 1940s, specifically the office of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in Chicago, 1947. The air is thick, a dense, unmoving mix of cheap machine oil, cold iron, and the stale scent of cigarette smoke that clings to the drywall like a second skin. It is midwinter, and the draft coming off Lake Michigan rattles the single-pane windows, a thin, skeletal sound that seems to mock the warmth of the radiator. Sunlight cuts through a high, narrow window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air above a scarred drafting table. Before you sits a design. It is not a watch. It is a graphic, a visual shorthand for fear. These are lines, not teeth. They are ink, not gears. Yet, when you look at it, the weight is identical. It is a heavy, reverberating concept you feel in your chest. The ink on that vellum is still drying, sharp and black against the yellowing paper. You can see the graphite smears where an editor changed the position of the minute hand, agonizing over the placement. In this space, time is not an abstract concept. It is physical, heavy, and silent. This is the birthplace of a symbol designed to do one thing: track the moment we ruin everything. It is the visual equivalent of a closing door. We usually think of clockmakers as quiet, precise figures obsessed with capturing the heartbeat of the universe, leaning over benches with loops pressed to their eyes. But the people who created the Doomsday Clock were not building a timepiece. They were nuclear physicists. And honestly, that's where the irony lies. They had spent their lives calculating the invisible, violent forces holding atoms together. They lived in equations, chalkboard proofs, and the dangerous beauty of theoretical discovery. Then they reached into that fundamental machinery and pulled out a lever that could erase a city. That shift from the antiseptic purity of the lab to the political podium was jarring. They stopped measuring the universe because they were paralyzed by what they had set in motion in the New Mexico desert. They traded telescopes for ink and paper. They became architects of anxiety because they were terrified of their own creation. They chose a clock hand to represent this because it triggers an immediate physical panic. Humans spent centuries perfecting clocks. We made time something you could hold in a pocket or hang on a cathedral tower. We controlled it. But the physicists at the Manhattan Project did not just split the atom. They shattered our sense of safety. On July 16, 1945, at the Trinity test site, a barren stretch of the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of the Dead, the sky did not just brighten, it broke. If you were miles away, facing the other direction, the light would still ignite against the mountain range in front of you. For a fraction of a second, the light was brighter than the midday sun. The heat hit the skin like a physical blow, a sudden, scorching sunburn on your cheek. The silence of the desert was annihilated by a roar that had never existed in human history, a sound so deep it didn't travel through the air, but through the earth beneath your boots. In that flash, the standard definition of time evaporated. Before Trinity, time was a background setting. It was infinite. After Trinity, time became a burning fuse. It could be snuffed out by a single catastrophic order. The scientists did not need a tool to measure the planets anymore. They needed a tool to measure the probability of nuclear incineration. They were no longer tracking the Earth, they were tracking human command. It is jarring to use a wall clock to track the annihilation of a species. The Doomsday Clock is an analog relic. 12 numbers, 2 hands, a sweep. We associate it with the quiet rhythm of daily life, not the instant fusion of a hydrogen bomb. But here's the thing, why use a symbol that does not measure time? Consider the alternative, a nuclear deterrence and megatonnage probability chart. It is a sterile data table. It lists missile yields, interception times, and fallout density in columns of numbers. It is accurate, but it evokes nothing. You read the data, your brain processes the math, and you move on. It feels like tax returns or weather patterns. But a clock? A clock is an urgent, ticking reminder of a deadline. It bypasses the logical brain and hits a visceral nerve. We reject the datasheet because it is cold. We embrace the clock because it is loud, simple, and final. It transforms statistical probability into a heartbeat. The visual metaphor does the heavy lifting that the math cannot. When you stare at this clock, you are watching a painted sliver of metal clicking forward against a static face. But the mechanism is a performance. If you gathered the total nuclear arsenal of the world, it would be enough to destroy the biosphere several times over. Yet, we fixate on the hand. We treat the Doomsday Clock like a speedometer on a car, calibrated by physics. In reality, it is a human decision. It is critical to note, the hands are set by a committee vote. It is not science, it is consensus. A group of people in a room deciding the time based on their collective anxiety. It is the definition of the illusion of precision. They deliberate on global treaties, climate models, and the geopolitical temperature of the day. They are not checking a gauge. They're analyzing the chaos of human politics. It is a subjective assessment wrapped in the guise of objective measurement. By framing annihilation as a countdown, they made the threat feel inevitable, like a calendar date. Look at the word midnight. Why that? It is a cultural marker for the end. If they had called it the 5 p.m. alarm, the urgency would vanish. By anchoring the concept to midnight, they turned an academic warning into a global panic trigger. It taps into the deepest fear we have about the end of time, that absolute final darkness. You feel that weight. That is not math. That is psychology. The most disturbing part of the clock is not the threat itself. It is the fact that we let the architects of the clock decide the time. We are waiting for them to tell us when we are finished. They hold the dial, then we just watch the hands move. If the clock ever strikes midnight, would we know? That is the real nightmare. We are looking at a human-defined endpoint, a conceptual deadline calibrated to fit our own anxiety. If that moment arrives, it will not be defined by the turning of a gear or the mechanical chime of a bell tower. It will be defined by us, by the decision to hit the button. We are the ones holding the dial, and we are the ones who decide when the ticking stops. Are we watching a countdown, or are we just staring at a mirror? We started with the tick of a watch, a sound that has defined our rhythm since we first carved notches into stone. We chase that precision because it makes the chaos of the world feel manageable, but that is the trap. The original 1947 design was not trying to be a precision instrument. It was a human scream. When you look at those hands, remember they are just metal. They do not measure the rotation of the planets. They measure our own fear of silence. If that hand finally clicks to 12, it will not be the sound of an ending. It will be a final, total silence. A room where the mechanism has stopped and there is no one left to hear the gears grind to a halt. When the clock stops moving, the brass gears just sit there, cold and still, waiting for a hand that will never come to wind them again.